theory has to have a priority.
Capitalism and artificial intelligence are the same thing.
The dimension of the future has disappeared.
There is actually no representation anymore.
There is no final resolution to contradiction.
Militant proletarian snake handling over abysses never gets much wilder than this.
All right, everybody, welcome back to The Dangerous Maybe. And today, wow, this one, I have been waiting to talk to this man for a very long time. We are here with Adrian Johnston today, and Nance and I couldn't be more thrilled about this one. We were just telling Adrian how influential he has been on us and our defense of subjectivity, how we think about subjectivity. And today we're going to be focused on Adrian's recent book, Infinite Greed, which just fantastic. One of the best critiques of capitalism from, this psychoanalytic infused perspective. And so this is a conversation a long time in the making, and just so excited. So before we get into it, Nance, what is up with you?
I'm hanging out. It's only fitting that before this interview, this long anticipated interview on our side, my camera and my interface decided to have a little aneurysm. So I'm on my secondary camera. My setup's a little janky today. But maybe it's fitting. Maybe, I don't know, doing things the hard way is a little bit better than just kind of sitting back passively and having everything fall into your lap. So yeah, I'm excited for this one. Thanks for being here, Adrian.
So Adrian, it is so great to meet you. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you both, Mikey and Nance, for inviting me. It's really, an honor and a pleasure to get to sit down with the two of you and have a conversation virtually. So I'm really looking forward to getting into it and, and to hearing what both of you have to say.
Fantastic. So, all right, everybody, the way we're planning for this to go is we want to start off by talking about infinite greed, and then we kind of want to zoom out a little bit to some more general questions. So, Adrian, what inspired you to write an entire book focused on the critique of capitalism, and what led up to motivated you to write Infinite Greed?
This particular book is one of those instances where one's teaching, and particularly at UNM for years, I regularly, roughly once every year and a half, I teach a course on Marxism for undergraduates at the 300 level. So, this for me is one of the courses I teach that I feel most passionate about, because it's an opportunity to expose young people to, this incredibly rich political theoretical tradition that, of course, often, goes undertaught or untaught, entirely. And so and the way that I structured the course each semester is, we have 16-week semesters here. First 8 weeks, we just read Marx and Engels themselves. And then the second 8 weeks, we deal with a various and sundry of their successors. So, Lenin, Lukács, et cetera, up through Althusser in the 1970s. And this course, every time I teach it, I find it really gets the students engaged. It stirs up a lot of interesting conversations in the classroom. And for me, it is very valuable because I get a sense of, from these students who are not, in most cases, only a few years out of high school. They're quite young, and getting a sense of what are they, what do they come to this course with in terms of their preconceptions, assumptions, biases, et cetera, about Marx and the whole tradition that bears his name. And really, a lot of the content of this book, these are reflections of mine on capitalism, and especially the critique of the capitalist political economy, a la Marx and his successors, where these ways of articulating all of this really took shape as a result of me talking with young people in the thick of our contemporary situation, having had a certain amount of usually, of course, anti-Marxist ideology drummed into them at earlier stages of their education, et cetera, and like working through with them, these sorts of controversies that they really, only have a kind of, one-sided sort of negative impression regarding, and just how to bring them in and how to get them to appreciate why this tradition is perhaps even more relevant than ever, and is essential for, you might say, cognitively mapping contemporary capitalism. And so, I just realized that basically with this book, a lot of it involved me writing down, um, you know, strategies of explanation, which I developed primarily through teaching this course year after year at UNM. So this book, of course, the ideal is, yeah, you have synergy going between your teaching and research as a professional academic, but, sometimes that doesn't work out. But this was one of those instances where it really did come together for me. And of course, behind all of this and my teaching of this course in the first place is just, yeah, my deep personal conviction that these are some of the best conceptual tools that we have in our toolkit for making sense of the insanity raging around us.
That's great. Okay, so I mean, I think another question for the sake of context, I think that would be helpful is, look, this book is, you can view it as a contribution to a long history of Marxism psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
And the question I would ask is, okay, how would you say that what you're doing with Marxism and psychoanalysis, it's part of this tradition, but it's obviously different than, say, the work of Marcuse.
Yeah.
What is your approach to Marxism and psychoanalysis, say, in opposition to some thinkers that have come before you?
Yeah, this I became, at least for me, it became clear that, yeah, one of the distinctive features of the manner in which I wanted to broker the marriage between Marxism on the one hand and psychoanalysis on the other was to do it differently than it had been done over the course of, since, Freudo-Marxism is roughly a century old. And to take this tradition that is very much tied to, in particular, Western Marxism. So, it's a way of approaching the Marxist tradition that, of course, traces its roots back, to figures like Lukács, Gramsci, Korsch, of course, the first generation of the Frankfurt School, et cetera. And one of the things that all of these Western Marxists have in common, going back to the young Lukács and then proceeding onward, is, of course, and this is most clear in especially Gramsci's prison notebooks, is that they were very worried about the, Soviet, in particular, the Soviet style of historical materialism that, in their view, was crudely, and in a vulgar fashion, economically reductive. That, you want to explain everything as a result of the causal mechanisms of economic history, relentlessly, inevitably, ceaselessly grinding out certain necessary results, and all of us are just reduced to mere cogs in this machinery, or nothing but economic categories. But before we started, and we were talking a little bit before we began the interview proper, I, something that you said is very much in the spirit of what I'm trying to do, which is that what capitalism really wants to do is to reduce us to merely our economic status, to our roles in terms of where we sit in the division of labor, in terms of class, position, various socioeconomic, statistical aspects of our being become what we feel like we are, and we really are, actually reduced to by the social reality that we inhabit. And here it's to say that, like, look, I mean, economic reduction is not so much, a theoretical misstep by Marxism. It's essential to describing what capitalism itself does in terms of its reality. It's not that, oh, well, we're imposing this economically reductive perspective on capitalist social history. It's that, no, capitalist social history imposes an economic reductionism in our reality upon all of us in the ways that it functions. And so getting over this like Western Marxist, what I came to see as exaggerated fear that if one grants the economy a certain priority in social theoretical explanation, that this will inevitably lead to some kind of vulgar, necessitarian, pseudo-Marxist version of historical materialism, a la like Stalin's 1938 dialectical and historical materialism. No. And that moreover, when you look at the consequences that Western Marxism has had in terms of the development of Marxist theory and then more loosely critical theory, in the academy, it's gotten to the point where you have people who are supposedly Marxists who are basically economically illiterate and don't have an understanding of how the economic mechanisms that Marx, brought to light in, the major works of his maturity, the Grundrisse and the volumes of Capital. If Marx were resurrected today, I mean, he would set about trying to get to grips with all of that in an updated, contemporarily accurate form. But we have instead, thanks to the Western Marxist anti-economist legacy, a sort of turning of Marxism and critical theory away from, and holding them apart from analyses of really operative economic mechanisms in our present. And then anyone who talks about that can be dismissed as, oh, you just want to go back to this kind of vulgar reductionistic, Stalinist type Marxism, where the invisible hand of economic history controls everything in this very, tight, direct fashion. And the thing is, we have to bear in mind, Freud, combinations of Marxism and psychoanalysis, almost all of them have been attempted in conjunction with a Western Marxist anti-economistic type of Marxism. And I was interested in, well, what about remarrying Marxism and psychoanalysis, but where the Marxism that you're marrying the psychoanalysis to is very much centered on the critique of political economy, and Marx's very careful analyses of how the core economic categories of capitalism function. And likewise too, when Marx even says what sounds like a methodological cautionary note, at the start of his critique of political economy, here we'll be dealing with people only insofar as they feature as economic categories. Another way to read that is that, in a sense, this is not just a methodological, epistemological caveat on Marx's part. There's something about the social ontology of capitalism itself, where again, it engages in real reductions, and they're hard, just like a la someone like Sohnrethel, real abstractions. There are also real reductions where we really do. It's not just that that reductionism is simply an intellectual vice or fault. There's actual real reduction at work in our social reality. And so, that's the kind of Marxism that I don't think you really see anyone working with in conjunction with psychoanalysis, at least in the past century of Freudo-Marxism, and even then the development of Lacano-Marxism. And to me, it seemed like this is a big missed opportunity, and that there are significant insights to be gained by bringing psychoanalytic concepts to bear on the machinery of the critique of political economy specifically, rather than limiting, the engagement with Marxism to what Marxism has to say about social superstructure, about, culture, ideology, et cetera. Yes, there's lots to say about that, but let's not neglect the infrastructural economic dimension too, which I think psychoanalytic Marxism, for most of its history, unfortunately, had done, given its reliance on the Western Marxist tradition. And bear in mind, too, that this is a result of Stalinism as well. In the 20s, during Lenin's time, you did have a few pioneers in the Soviet context trying to wed Marxism with Freudian psychoanalysis, who I talk about, and I talk about these figures in Infinite Greed, like Luria and Vygotsky. But then, once Lenin died and Stalin took over, psychoanalysis was deemed, a perverse, decadent, bourgeois ideology to be, stamped out, and that was it. Further work in that vein in the Soviet context was verboten.
That's great. Okay. So we kind of touched on this combination of Marxism and psychoanalysis, which is really at the heart of the introduction of the book. Before we get into the rest of the book, because the book consists of 4 main chapters and then there's also a conclusion. Before we get into that, I like asking authors to talk about the epigraphs they select for their books. And you have 2 really good ones here. And so I was wondering if we could get you to just kind of unpack or kind of free associate on these 2
Yes.
quotes. So Karl Marx, you quote, he says, "For capitalism is already essentially abolished once we assume that it is enjoyment that is the driving motive and not enrichment itself." What's going on there?
Yes. With that, Marx. So this, and to come back to the first question that we started with, one thing that I found in terms of teaching Marxism to undergraduate students here at UNM year after year is that they typically claim that, well, capitalism, if nothing else, is all about servicing our selfishness, that it panders to our desire for, various forms of comfort, titillation, gratification, distraction, etc. That it, at least, if nothing else, delivers us enjoyable consumables, and that the fact that it taps into this selfish tendency that human beings have to try and, in this very kind of standard sort of vaguely utilitarian or even like crude Freudian pleasure principle fashion, that we're really just seeking to maximize our pleasure and minimize our pain, and capitalism, with the fact that it's oriented around people's selfishness and that it seeks to provide us with ever better commodities, etc. Like some of the students, you really get a sense that for them, well, if we abolish capitalism, then wait, the next iteration of the iPhone won't come out, or this whatever commodity it is, right? Yeah. And one of the things that I think you are with it, and that when I came across this remark by Marx that I use as that first epigraph that you quoted a moment ago, Mikey, it was Marx himself saying, that's the mistake, right? What you have to realize is that although capitalism packages itself as pandering to selfishness, conceived of as each of us as individuals wanting to maximize our comfort, satisfaction, pleasure, etc., and that capitalism does that, and that if we were to transition into socialism or communism, we wouldn't have all of these fun gadgets and toys. We'd have to use the same communal toothbrush. We'd all be wearing the same dull gray jumpsuits, etc. I mean, these are the sorts of images that they have in their heads when they think of socialism and communism still. But me pointing out that it's like, look, Marx himself already indicates that what capitalism ultimately demands is just the ceaseless accumulation of surplus value in perpetuity. Or in less technical language today, you could even just say, all right, the demand for at least 3% global growth every year, year after year, indefinitely. And that is the imperative, regardless of whether or not individual human beings caught up in this process are enjoying themselves or having their selfish desires pandered to, etc. And this then helps explain why, it's like, look, various features of capitalism, in fact, seem to demand an enormous amount of self-sacrifice, of pain and renunciation, of enduring really undesirable negative consequences in various forms, up to and including now, like the demand for global growth, year after year in perpetuity. As Koei Saito nicely put it in his work on degrowth, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. But we still keep pushing in that direction because the fundamental imperative of the machinery of capital is, regardless of what the individuals caught up in it feel about it, it constantly has to throw off ever more surplus value for the sake of accumulation as an end in itself. Consequences be damned, including really undesirable consequences that are anything but providing us with pleasure, satisfaction, contentment, titillation, etc. So, it was really like that epigraph from Marx is a reminder that what capitalism is about is not what we often think it is about. It is not about basically accommodating an ineliminable selfish streak in human nature. That is not what it is about, despite many of capitalism's apologists, or at least those who are, if nothing else, simply resigned to its reign. This is part of why they think, well, it will last forever. Other forms of society, demand that we try and overcome the selfishness of our human nature. That's impossible, so we have to work with it rather than against it. And capitalism does that. And this is a reminder from Marx that no, it doesn't actually.
Okay. And then this quote really kind of jumped out at me when I first read it. So Jacques Lacan says, "It is only the phallus that is happy, not the bearer of said."
Yes. And it's an interesting, I think, also anticipation of, Zizek's wonderful gloss on the canned laughter in television sitcoms. And of course, at this point, that's a somewhat dated cultural reference, but, most of us are old enough to know what that involves.
And it's still there in like the Big Bang Theory. And
it is? Okay. Yeah. I unfortunately right now, being department chair with 2 young children, et cetera, I don't have a lot of time for keeping up with the world of television at this point, but no, I'm glad to know that it's not a completely obsolete reference.
I
But,
admit, like, my reference to the Big Bang Theory itself is a bit obsolete, but I mean, even there's still, Nance, what's like a sitcom on right now that still uses it? Can you think of one?
I couldn't tell you, but I mean, I think it has an analog on like social media. Like people do the hearts and the cheers and the flowers on TikTok posts. Like I think that's a updated version of it.
That's good. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And like, and for Zizek with the canned laughter sort of doing the enjoying for you in this displaced prosthetic fashion, right? And, when Lacan, says, it's only the phallus that is happy, not the bearer of said, there's definitely a resonance there. But what I had in mind specifically, one example I can give you, I remember years ago, this was in the early 2000s when I was at Emory University in Atlanta doing my psychoanalytic training at the Psychoanalytic Institute there. And while I was there, of course, since I came to psychoanalytic training with a PhD in philosophy rather than an MD in psychiatry, the American Psychoanalytic Association requires non-MDs to do all of the additional background training that will give them the same body of knowledge of things like psychodiagnostics and psychopharmaceuticals that they can assume the MD psychiatrist got in med school. And during this time, like when I was doing things like, having to, DSM was then in its 4th edition, having to, do things like, study the DSM-4 very closely and work with, one of the psychiatric training analysts on it. I remember a documentary film came out entitled The Corporation. I think it came out in 2003 or 2004. Mm-hmm. And I went to go see it. And, as it started, I immediately recognized that what the film was doing at the beginning when talking about the idea of corporations as persons, a la this legal status, saying if it was a person, how would we characterize it? I immediately recognized that they were starting to run down the DSM diagnostic checklist for a diagnosis of psychopathy. And I thought, oh no, we're going to get some sort of like, these people are psychopaths, psychological villainization, CEOs, et cetera. And I thought, this probably won't be very rewarding. But fortunately, no. It quickly became clear that the film was much more subtle than that. And the idea of a kind of depsychologized structural psychopathy that the invisible hand of intercapitalist competition forces, for instance, these CEOs to behave, to do things which, from a psychological standpoint, we would see as diagnosable, traits of being an actual psychopath. But it's not that they are at a first person level this way, And so, for example, I remember the then, CEO of BP was being interviewed along with some other, people who were involved in, the oil industry. And the CEO of BP, first of all, is very clear. This is just like, a very normal, easy to relate to individual in terms of, his empirical, psychological, disposition or makeup. I mean, somebody you can easily imagine, having a casual conversation with over coffee. And it's not that he's like, I think, secretly a psychopath. I mean, in fact, when they asked him, okay, how do you feel about things when you have to move production, overseas and outsource and lay all these people off and things like that? He's like, it really does break my heart. I don't want to do it, but if I don't do it, we lose ground and perhaps eventually we're out of business. I mean, my hand is forced, right? And it seems to me that, in terms of, and so he's not like sadistically enjoying, this
It's not Squid
psychopathic
Game.
behavior. No, that's right. But of course, it's as though this anonymous, impersonal corporation is person entity, and with its legal status, its economic, reality, et cetera, then becomes a sort of proxy agent, sort of like the prosthetic phallus, that does the enjoying of all of this, without the individuals who are enacting it, getting anything out of it. In fact, suffering, right? I mean, the CEO is like, I don't want to have to do these things, but the whip hand of of competition in my sector of industry forces me to move in this direction, right? And likewise too, where the endless accumulation that capitalists engage in. Like, one question I would pose to students that's very related to this Lacan epigraph, say, well, look, if what capitalism was really about was enjoying consumption and individual selfishness in that sense, if that were the motive of people like Bezos, Musk, Thiel, et cetera, well, you would figure that they would long ago have decided to just retire early. And you're sitting on billions of dollars that you've accumulated. I mean, you get in a situation like that 1985 Richard Pryor movie, Brewster's Millions, where like if you were challenged to spend it all, you couldn't. It's just you have more than you could possibly consume in multiple lifetimes. And if it's all about just individual enjoyment of first person pleasures through consumption, then most capitalists, once they even got into the multi-million-dollar range, would probably just drop out and retire, right?
Mm-hmm.
But there's a sense of this compulsion to just keep accumulating, right? And that indicates that it's not about enjoyment. When Marx says enjoyment, in that first epigraph, he doesn't mean Lacanian enjoyment. Genuss, the German word he's using there is really just we could also translate as pleasure. But with the Lacanian idea of it's only the phallus that is happy, not the bearer of said. Even with those individuals who are the biggest of the big bourgeoisie, like the major capitalist players, right? That it's not really that this is about them enjoying themselves. In fact, it's as though this kind of undead compulsion forces them to keep on accumulating long past the point where they have acquired more than enough wealth to be able to wallow in various and sundry forms of first personal consumptive gratification for multiple lifetimes over, right? But again, they keep going, and they keep going in this way, which seems to indicate that if there's any enjoyment in this, it's not what they're experiencing. It's as though like their status as bearers of the phallus qua representatives of class status as the dominant members of the big bourgeoisie. That's the kind of, you could think of as a sort of like phallic authority position, but they don't enjoy being in that position in the way that when we explain human behavior on the basis of the motivation of first person pleasure gratification, etc., would seem to be really what's running the show there. Instead, it's this blind, ceaseless imperative to accumulate in perpetuity and without end, even long past the point where it's doing anything for you, or maybe even like, keeping you working, doing this in a way that is just indifferent to whether or not you're enjoying yourself in terms of, again, the non-Lacanian sense of taking pleasure in consumption, satisfying your selfish impulses and urges, etc. So yeah, it's like, okay, today's capitalists are, in a way, bearers of a phallus, but a phallus where their bearing of it can be as much of a burden as anything, and that moreover, it's this external prosthesis of a socio-symbolic sort, that is, kind of running the show and maybe enjoying itself, but certainly not all of us caught up in it, including up to those of us who are the most privileged members of this nightmare, society based on, grotesque inequality.
So we could say, to reword it a bit, it is only capital itself that enjoys, not the
Yes.
capitalist whose strings capital pulls.
Bingo. That is a beautifully succinct crystallization or distillation of what I'm after there. Exactly.
Awesome.
I like
yes.
It's a black iron phallus.
Yes. That would be a good idea for a book cover at some point. Oh,
I love it. Okay.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about so one thing we love to do, we love to have the chance to ask an author to kind of summarize an argument or what, to kind of stand back from a chapter and kind of say, this is what this really means to me now that I think about it. So, I kind of like to ask you about each of the chapters. So chapter 1 is the conflicted political animal, the psychoanalytic body, and the body politic. So kind of reflecting on the book a year after it's published, what do you think about this chapter? What stands out to you?
Well, for me, the major thing that chapter accomplishes is, going back to the later Freud. Freud, once you have Marxism to the geopolitical fore, thanks particularly to the October 1917 revolution in Russia. And soon after the Bolsheviks take power, you see Freud begin to make various and sundry remarks, sometimes just in passing, sometimes more developed. But Freud starts saying things in terms of expressing his views as a psychoanalytic thinker on what is transpiring in the Soviet context. And one of the best known places where one sees this is in Freud's well-known later text, Civilization and Its Discontents. And it certainly seems that when you look at Freud's scattered remarks about Marxism, in the 20s and 30s, that he does seem to express reservations about it that sound like forerunners of this standard, which again I kept hearing from my students in that course that I teach on the Marxist tradition for undergraduates, that human beings are incorrigibly selfish animals by nature. We can't reform or revolutionize this away. We simply have to accommodate it. Capitalism does that. That's its distinctive feature. That's what makes it the most rational and likely to endure socioeconomic arrangement, because it's realistic about human nature in a way that previous socioeconomic systems were not. And it's a lot of what Freud has to say sounds very much in that vein. But then what I realized is that despite there being a fair amount of literature on Freud and politics in various senses, nobody had really engaged as a Marxist who was also, psychoanalytically trained, nobody had done a kind of sympathetic psychoanalytic Marxist critical assessment of the later Freud's perspectives on the Soviet experiment and what psychoanalysis has to say in response to the Marxist tradition that experiment is rooted in. And I think that I was able to show in that chapter that there are, regardless of Freud's own personal views, his individual political convictions, et cetera. I mean, of course, Freud himself was no Marxist, but one can show that that Freud's own work provides a basis for, in fact, saying that Marxism is anything but unrealistic, and that there are various and sundry aspects of how the human psyche works, the manner in which our libidinal tendencies operate, how through psychosexual development we are shaped and formed by our social environment, et cetera, that there's much in Freud's theory about those topics that points in the direction of a more sympathetic psychoanalytic stance vis-a-vis Marxism than Freud himself offers by way of his explicit remarks concerning that tradition. And so I felt like, this one was doing something that, again, I hadn't seen done in the past century of Freudo-Marxist literature, where there was a really serious Marxist sympathetic, but also Freud sympathetic critical assessment of Freud's various and sundry commentaries on Marxism, on Bolshevism, et cetera. And so it's in a way a kind of Marxist defanging of Freud's critique of Marxism in a very imminent fashion in terms of using Freud's own theoretical resources against him in terms of his critique of Marxism, and showing that he really, if he stuck to his metapsychological guns consistently, would not be so quick to make some of these critical remarks about Marxism as he does. So, I thought that that was a really worthwhile aspect to what that chapter does. And in doing that, I think also for anyone who wants to marry Marxism with psychoanalysis, if like one of the founding figures of those two traditions, voices all of these objections to the other tradition you're trying to, bring into the picture, it seems incumbent on you to, get to grips with those arguments and objections of the founding figure, in this case Freud. And so, how would a psychoanalytic Marxist respond to Freud's own criticisms of Marxism? And I felt like that work hadn't been done and kind of needed to be done to help clear the way for kind of revisiting this relationship between these two intellectual orientations and remarrying them in a different way than had been done before.
Awesome. That's great. I mean, we'll probably come back to stuff that you just touched on when we get more into the more basic questions. But I mean, chapter 2. Let's talk about that. So it's called "From Closed Need to Infinite Greed: Marxian Drives."
Yes.
What is a Marxian drive, Adrian?
Well, this is one of the interesting findings for me when I was going back through and really bearing down on, and here in terms of teaching, I also regularly do a graduate seminar, for our MA and PhD students here on Marx. And I usually will do either the Grundrisse or Capital Volume 1 and just spend a semester working through those texts. But, in terms of teaching that, that really, crucial, mature, critique of political economy material of Marx's, one thing that I discovered is that Marx repeatedly in the German talks about capitalism as involving a certain Trieb, the same German word that Freud uses that, is to be properly translated as drive rather than, with the standard edition Strachey translation of Freud, it gets rendered as instinct, which is indeed a big mistranslation that's had some problematic consequences for the history of psychoanalysis. But not only does Marx before Freud, use this particular German word to refer to this peculiar motivational structure of, how capitalism functions, but that much of what Marx had to say about Trieb brought to light for me that, he's talking about it in a way that does anticipate Freud in terms of a kind of a structure of human motivation that is not, biologically hardwired, that is not simply a matter of endogenous, organic instinctual forces and factors and, compelling us to behave in certain ways. That instead, and Freud famously in 1915, of Zesty Drives and Their Vicissitudes, says a drive is, a kind of hybrid entity straddling the two sides of soma and psyche. But also, there's the sense of the experiential and social mediation of a drive, and that drives are these, structures of motivation that are plastic and receptive to our environment, to our, social relations, et cetera, and that gets, reworked and reconfigured by all of these mediating forces and factors that, bear down upon us. And that, Marx was talking about, drives very much like that. And, then looking at the link between, human motivation and all of this socioeconomic machinery that configures our first person individual motivations in ways that then, come to reflect a logic that in a sense has been implanted in us by our surrounding social context. And one of Zizek's favorite claims of the later Lacan in connection with Marxism is Lacan's assertion, starting in the early 1970s, that Marx invented the psychoanalytic concept of the symptom, a la Freud, albeit avant la lettre. And I wanted to add to that and say, well, apart from the question of, all right, Marx's ways of treating certain social phenomena as symptomatic of an underlying socioeconomic logic, that Marx also could be credited in the same way, in Lacanian style, with inventing avant la lettre the psychoanalytic concept of drive als trieb. And so, and I think that in chapter 2, I lay out, I force the reader to march through quite a bit of the mature Marx's writings on Capital and looking at passages, looking at the German, et cetera. But I think that the evidence that I lay out there is really, quite powerful in terms of substantiating this claim that yes, Marx was already dealing with human motivation as, complexly structured in ways that very much anticipate some of what is central to Freud's own concept of trieb, which of course Lacan rightfully identifies in 1964 as one of the four quote unquote fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis. And so, it makes it so that it's not like, oh, you have Marx talking about, the socioeconomic dimension over here, and then only with Freud do we get this notion of the psyche with its libidinal economy, in addition to Marx's political economy. And then we have to, as these two things are, separate from each other, we have to then bring them together. And I want to show that no, for Marx, there's already a complex intertwining of what we might call libidinal and political economy in a way that then, Freud too, when you look at how Freud talks about libidinal economy, at least implicit in a lot of that is that necessarily as part of the world of social relations, political economy is going to influence libidinal economy too. And so in a way, both thinkers, through their ways of talking about drive, emphasize this intertwining of libidinal and political economies. And I felt like that hadn't really been seen before. And so I really sought to bring it out as clearly, persuasively, and as evident, as textually substantiated a manner as I could. And so, and I really felt like chapter 2 is kind of a load-bearing chapter for the book as a whole, really like establishing that there is all of this already in Marx's critique of political economy. And it's a matter of bringing it out and making it so that psychoanalysis and Marxism don't even really need to be brought together as two like things that are external to and different from each other, that it's more like bringing out how they already, in a sense, imply each other from their very origins with their two founding figures.
It's because of that. This is why it's one of my favorite chapters in the book. And so let me tell you, there's something Nance and I have dealt with for a long time with our Marxist friends, some of our Marxist friends. who basically think, hey, we don't need this stuff on libidinal economy to understand capitalism. We don't need Freud. We don't need Lacan. We don't need Žižek. All this stuff about death drive and jouissance and fantasy and all this, it's not relevant. It's not there in Marx. I think you make a very strong case that, sorry, Marxists, being anti-libidinal economy is to be anti-Marx.
Yes, that's right. Not just to say that, oh well, you're not helping yourself to these additional conceptual explanatory resources that are out there. It's to say that you can't even remain faithful to the one tradition you want to put as the basket into which you want to put all your own eggs, if you don't also bring this into view. And yes, I think that had Marx lived to see it, he would have recognized that psychoanalysis indeed, further has brought out aspects of how things like human motivation function in ways that I think Marx would have considered to be invaluable to making sense of why, as the agents in capitalism that we are, with being bearers of certain economic categories, why we behave the way we do. Up to and including, I think psychoanalysis is crucial too, and especially with some of the psychoanalytic concepts, Mikey, that you mentioned a moment ago. Why is it that, because we're in this strange situation where it seems like many of us, and not a tiny minority of fringe Marxists, but people in general just have the sense of all of this that's happening in our current world, in terms of capitalism bringing about environmental catastrophe, leading to further wars, ushering us into, slavery to our, techno oligarch lords, etc. And people are, there's widespread upset about all of this. And yet, despite all of this discontent, we keep doing the same shit and we keep perseverating on this path. And I think to explain that, a Marxism without psychoanalysis, I think, is really going to have difficulty being able to account for why, even when it's clear to like a critical mass of people that this is madness that must end, it still doesn't end. It just keeps on going, And I think that you need psychoanalysis to help make sense of that strange perseveration on our part in an arrangement that we, things like, again, you can't have infinite growth on a finite planet. I think that many people would agree with that just at a kind of general intellectual level, but then for some reason that intellectual acceptance of that inconvenient truth, so to speak, doesn't seem to have any efficacy in changing our behavior. And this, again, is something I think psychoanalysis can be very helpful with explaining, and that Marxism, I think, needs.
Well, I think a lot of the Marxists we talk to about this, obviously some fully agree with like, we need both. We need them as a unit.
Yeah.
Some don't, though. And the ones that just want to be pure Marxists, at least from their way of viewing it, it's still like organize the working class. And I'm like, do you guys not get jouissance and death drive? Why this is, if we were really just homo economicus, you should be able to just explain to your average working class person, this is not in your self-interest. It's not operating in this way. And, so recently, I think we told you before we started, one of the exegeses we did was Mark Fisher's famous essay, Terminator versus Avatar. And in it, he quotes this famous citation from Lyotard's Libidinal Economy, which is a book I wanted to ask you about because I think it's obviously very close to your book, but also you could view it as far away in certain regards. But there's a quote from Lyotard that I think is just perfect to get your thoughts on. And he basically knew he was going to get canceled among his academic Marxist friends for what I'm about to read. So Lyotard says, the English unemployed did not have to become workers to survive. They, hang on tight and spit on me, enjoyed the hysterical, masochistic, whatever exhaustion it was of hanging on in the mines, in the foundries, in the factories, in hell. They enjoyed it, enjoyed the mad destruction of their organic body, which was indeed imposed upon them, They enjoyed the decomposition of their personal identity, the identity of the peasant tradition had constructed for them, enjoyed the disillusions of their families and villages, and enjoyed the new monstrous anonymity of the suburbs and the pubs in the morning and the evening.
Yeah.
And he's right. Like, nobody wanted to hear that back then. But I'm telling you, like, as a working class guy, that is so much more true than workers just have a conceptual misunderstanding of their material conditions and need to be educated, and they will fall in line and become the revolutionary subject.
Yep, and I fully agree with that too. And that, moreover, again, there's also in the background just, what the very category of working class, means now, versus, what Marx had in view, in the mid 19th century. I mean, another reason we can't just simply return to Marx or stick to Marx only, et cetera, and have, this, very kind of traditional view of, all right, the real task is to generate class consciousness in the proletariat, and that once that is accomplished, then we will move towards a working class led, political revolution. On we go. There's just so much that makes it glaringly apparent that the world that reflects long ago ceased to exist, right? And that, and so to begin with, it would be like, to even, to talk about going out into the working class and trying to make them aware of their objective economic interests. But it's then, well, which portion of that? I mean, people, are we talking about just, like, you've got migrant labor, you've got gig labor, you've got people working in retail, you've got people
or
working
old blue collar
in
labor,
and
remains.
all blue collar too. Yeah, there's a little bit of that remains, and then of course a lot of that in other places like China. And just the challenges of even just turning this disparate mass of people who are all being screwed by capitalism, but each being screwed in somewhat different ways, and there are various shapes that this can take on. I mean, it's even resulted in the loss that there's any sense of some sort of group there, some sort of solid unified mass of people who experience themselves as all in the same boat, as all categorizable in terms of and this is where also with Marx talking about, yes, capitalism will, make the class landscape ever starker and ever more a matter of a strict, division between, more and more people will be sorted into the bourgeoisie or the proletariat, and all these other kind of like, class distinctions in between will shrink and vanish, and we'll get this very stark opposition. And that obviously hasn't happened in the way that Marx was expecting. And there's been, I think, great success in keeping, if we just want to think about it as like a crude haves versus have-nots, making it so the have-nots seem so disparate, distinct from each other, disunified, et cetera, that you would first have to constitute a group that would think of itself as a unified class, and then try and persuade them of where their objective interests lay. I mean, we're so far from that. And so, yeah, I really do think that there's a lot to what Lyotard is saying there. And, furthermore, he's right that one of the things that psychoanalysis teaches us is that when we are brutally immiserated, we still manage to find ways to obey the pleasure principle and to get some sort of libidinal mileage out of our misery, and we become invested in sometimes hugging our chains, singing in our cages, etc. If only, and not in a way where it's like, oh, we're the complicit dupes here. It's just to have a sense that anything else is even possible requires are so beaten down and so deprived of time and energy, and and also like the benefits of, education. Go ahead, Mikey.
I'm sorry. No, on my end, it just kind of glitched out for a moment. I'm sorry.
Oh, Oh
So-
yeah, I just backtracked. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, but
Just for a minute, like 30 seconds.
okay, yeah. Well, I think that one of the things Leotard is identifying there, yes, psychoanalysis helps illuminate, but in addition, it also indicates that, one of the problems we're facing is that for things like a kind of class consciousness or an accurate assessment of your real material interests, et cetera, to be possible for all of the victims of capitalism, a certain amount of minimal improvement is already necessary. Like that we need, like Marx even talked about how you needed labor unions to first alleviate some of the worst forms of suffering for the English industrial working class before they could even envision something like a more revolutionary socio-political project. And so, yeah, and I think that, depriving people of education, time, and energy is a way of making it so that their only option is, as Leotard describes it, to basically learn how to hug their chains and sing in their cages and try and enjoy themselves, even if only at that very miserable level.
Yeah. Okay. Before anything more generally, just to say about Leotard's libidinal economy and how it factors into this Freudo-Marxist tradition.
Well, the honest thing, and this will be very, very brief, is I read that book back in graduate school, I think, and so unfortunately, I didn't go back and revisit it when working on Infinite Greed. I mean, there were certain, contributions to talking about the Marxism psychoanalysis intersection that I just didn't manage to squeeze in there, and that, for me, it was more that. Some of the better known kind of big names in Freudo-Marxism in that tradition were already dealing with them as foils. Again, I already went to 700 pages with the first version of the manuscript, and then the publisher said no, we need to cut this. But yeah, But I'm curious, is there something in there in Leotard's book that you're thinking of that you would like
I
to
just
have me
think that
address?
this insistence he had, which was to say, look, Marxist organizers, you don't get how libidinally hooked workers are on capitalism. And it's not an intellectual mistake. It's not false consciousness. It has everything to do with the self-destructive forms of jouissance they get out of it. And it wasn't like he was just, I mean, this is the way I read it. I don't think he was judging the workers. He's trying to say, you guys are trying to pull off something here as far as what you think you can organize without understanding the libidinal dynamics of what's really going on with working class people. And if you're not going to do anything if you're not tapped in to this reality, but he knew that saying workers enjoyed their exploitation would get him spit on. Nance?
Yes.
It's like he was seeing that the Marxists or organizers or whatever, these advocates, whatever, they are trying to reduce workers to this kind of function, this utopian function of revolutionary subject, without taking their libidinal economy into account. So it's like a different kind of reduction, which I think is oddly fitting.
Yes, and that I am very sympathetic towards, and I think again, right down to, you might say, Marxist political agents. One of the implications of all this would be, thinking to really accept Leotard's objections would require, I think, from a psychoanalytic angle, conceiving of, instead of just trying to, in this very cerebral intellectualist fashion, browbeat workers out of their investments in these various forms of pleasure, or even jouissance, we could call it, given its self-destructive qualities, instead of just trying to, because likewise in psychoanalysis, it's not like, it's like you get the Saturday Night Live parody of therapy where, the therapist is just like, just stop it, right? Why are you doing this to yourself? Just cut it out, right? Just telling people to cut it out, doesn't really do the trick. And likewise, it seems to me that what would then have to be, conceived of would be, how do you allow for a kind of sublimation, a sort of creative working with rather than against these libidinal investments of the workers in certain aspects of what we might consider to be, we could call their culture, their day-to-day lives, and looking at the very fabric of their rhythms and routines and their lives as suffused with these various libidinal investments and certain kinds of pleasure, enjoyment, and so on. finding ways to, harness that and to channel it into, other forms of pleasure or enjoyment, but that ones which would not, involve helping keep them, in place, in the end, doing what, capital demands of them day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. And, when you think about how Marx talked about, early forms of labor union organization as a preliminary step to creating, a working class that would then be able to go further than just mere reform. It involved things like having, like social gatherings, having, at the union hall, like getting together for, like beer and barbecue, or having reading groups, or like finding these pleasurable activities that are also enriching and empowering for the workers as kind of a first step. And that kind of, I think, indicates that Marx already had, kind of an inkling of some of this. And I think things like that would be important. But I must admit, at this point, I'm leaning more towards, Slavoj has started recently talking about, essentially any communist utopia is going to be a desperate invention forced upon us by really catastrophic circumstances. And that, once we get to the point where environmental degradation has gone, even further than it is already, at some point with that, or, with AI, or, other like of these massive, existential threats to humanity.
We're living in the end times.
That's right. And it's that it's really going to be, we're not going to, end up trying to pursue utopia based on sitting back in our armchairs and realizing, no, this would be, in our objective best interest collectively to do. It's going to be, oh my God, we can no longer, obey the rules of capital, because if, as a matter of survival, we have to violate them. We like, if you think about, like, if AI really does bring about the much feared jobs apocalypse, it really is going to force a choice on us. And it's going to be, okay, the implicit tenet of the capitalist social contract for the vast majority of us is you have to work to eat. If we get to the point where you have this jobs apocalypse, it's like that social contract just simply cannot hold as a reality anymore. And then we're faced again with the old Engels Luxembourg question: socialism or barbarism, right? Do we resign the massive humanity to grinding poverty and starvation, and soon after death, or do we then realize, since we can no longer enforce a social contract with this stipulation that you have to work to eat, do
Adrian,
we essentially
what do you think
just...
of the contradiction we seem to be staring at on the horizon, which is, okay, if AI automation truly does kick in the next 10 years, and there's no jobs to give anybody, or 50% of people are out of work, let's just say. Here's the contradiction that capitalism is bringing about is one that Marx already knew. Okay, so capitalists automate in order to outcompete each other. That's a structural dynamic within competition. The more that you automate, the more you do away with wage laborers, which means the more you do away with consumer buying power. AI robots are not going to watch Netflix. They're not going to eat at McDonald's. So there's a structural necessity where the capitalists would go running to the state, give them UBI, give them something like UBI, because we need them to consume.
Yes. But then there's another like paradox here too that Marx was well aware of. And, of course, one of the most controversial components of his mature critique of political economy was his discussion of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall in capitalism in volume 3 of Capital. And, for Marx, of course, yes, intra-capitalist competition forces ever more automation on capitalist production, but automation, of course, involves, increasing the amount of what Marx called constant capital in the guise of machinery over variable capital, which is living labor. But of course, for Marx's account of surplus value as the source of profit, the only generator of surplus value is labor, right? It's exploited labor that produces surplus value, and that from surplus value you get profit for the capitalist, you get interest for the financial capitalist, as distinct from the industrial capitalist. You get taxes for the state, right? And then rent for various and sundry, landlords. And now we also, of course, have some virtual landlords as well as, the old bricks and mortar kind of landlords. And so, if you have production basically eliminate wage labor, I mean, not only do you no longer have workers with who can exert what Keynes called effective demand, who have purchasing power to buy your goods, right? In addition, if you eliminate living labor from the production process, you no longer have that production process generative of surplus value. And so, you would get to the point where, since, this, according to Marx, what the state takes in taxes is also a portion of that surplus value. Well, you're going to get to a point where there's not enough surplus value being generated in the productive process to provide the state with an adequate amount in taxation that then can be redistributed in the guise of universal basic income. So it's like you've got problems from multiple directions that all indicate that none of this can keep going in the form that we're familiar with. That, like, capitalism, again, it's not going to be, I think, even at so much an active revolutionary agent in the classical Marxist sense, where you have a class-conscious proletariat unify and in a kind of internationalist movement topple a whole bunch of states and institute socialist revolutions. I think instead it's just going to be that capitalism really does bankrupt itself in these ways that I don't think people adequately see coming. And that doesn't just involve, all right, you won't have enough consumers who can buy things because all of these people have been thrown out of work. I mean, in addition, universal basic income would have to come, through taxes and state redistribution. And if surplus value is being eliminated thanks to full automation, which Marx, for Marx would be like the end on the horizon of his account of the tendency of the law of profit to fall in capitalism. Well, UBI won't be a solution either. And so, what are we going to do here? And that, it seems, and this is, also where, like, I have a real agreement with Slavoj. When another thing my undergrads often object to is like, oh, central economic planning doesn't work, right? Look at the Soviet 5-year plans, et cetera. But now the kind of capitalism we have is so centralized. It's like a new form of monopoly capitalism, where it's so centralized that one of my responses is we're already doing central planning, right? I mean, essentially, the big tech companies are central planners of all of the internet mediated sides of our lives now, right? And so you have these huge conglomerates controlled by a tiny handful of people. And it, in a way, makes the revolutionary task easier, where it's like, where Žižek talks about, you just, if you just lop off the heads of these things and socialize them, that does actually, promise that we could do central planning pretty readily. And of course, the objections to central planning are an objection to it before the era of things like big data and, AI being able to parse all this information. This machinery could become liberatory rather than oppressive for us, because it very well could allow for this kind of horizontal collective social planning of production that Marx, anticipated. And that you might say that the Soviets tried to do it without things like, without AI, big data, et cetera. But now that capitalism has produced these technological innovations, yes, it's currently using them to fuck us all over. But potentially, this could make it so that our sense of, oh, you can't have socialism because economic central planning doesn't work, for example. Guess what? They're already doing it. So we just need to be like, why are we letting someone like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk reap these huge personal gains by holding this machinery in private hands that is, a kind of, at the same time, given the size and scale of these monopolies, is maximally socialized production in the Marxist sense.
Adrian, are you familiar with this book, Inventing the Future, by Nick
I
Cernicek
haven't
and
read
Alex
it.
Williams?
I am familiar with the whole accelerationist, standpoint.
Yeah.
But yeah.
For them, they make this argument like, look, central planning, the way that it's typically talked about, right, yeah, it was a problem because we're trying to have humans organize an entire economy, but
Yeah.
they say, look, with the level of computation, development in AI, all of this type of computer technology, it makes algorithmic communism possible, which would be an automated economy rooted in computation and computer technology that can figure out distribution, production rates, all this kind of stuff, and AI could be used to liberate us from work and lay this material infrastructure, economic infrastructure, that once up and running, we could all get on with pursuing what we find meaningful in life, opposed to being
Yes.
stuck in wage labor. So, I mean,
Yeah.
there are people out there trying to think through how this
Yeah.
could go in a way that benefits the human, as opposed
Yes.
to destroying us.
Yes, and I'm very sympathetic to that. Although for me, there are at least two really sticky points that would have to be worked out in connection with, an algorithmic,
Okay, what are they?
All right. Well, first would be, of course, you're still, the idea that we would automate this initially and say, okay, we're now going to turn over the governance of production, the determination of what we produce, how much of different things we produce, how those get redistributed, et cetera, et cetera. That there would be essentially this upfront labor of us outsourcing the decision making to this technology, and then it would run of its own accord, and would become sort of like a techno scientific invisible hand, which would centrally control production and organize all of it. Obviously, there's going to have to be continual oversight of this, I think, by human beings, and including not just, all right, we have to update code, or we have to tweak these aspects of the algorithms, et cetera. But like those questions themselves also involve, necessarily, given what we're talking about, social and political considerations, and that will still have to bring into play our ideas about fairness, justice, equality, et cetera. And the question of, okay, what sort of political apparatus are we going to have that is going to help govern our management and you might say ongoing tweaking of this kind of algorithmic AI automated economic infrastructure. And so there, it's like, I still think that, there would be questions about, issues of, all right, is some sort of bureaucratic state apparatus still necessary? Could this be done in terms of what would be some 21st century version of worker Soviets, et cetera? Those questions I don't think would get resolved by this, and we would still have to deal with them. And then the other thing is to come back to the environmental issue. One thing that I sometimes worry about with some of the accelerationists is that it seems as though, they are untroubled by this idea of, well, you could continue to have this, really explosive economic output that you have under capitalism, but just, more equally distributed, right? But you could still have a system that was going to crank out, a lot of no longer commodities, but consumable goods, et cetera. It would just be getting run by things like AI. But that still, would butt up against, all right, what about the environmental degradation that seems inevitable in terms of us continuing to produce and consume the amount that we produce and consume, and how are we going to deal with that? And whether or not we could, for instance, outsource that decision making about the environmental impact to AI. That's another area where, I think, no, we human beings would still be stuck having to wrestle with, okay, do we tell the AI to, do we get the AI to really, kind of gradually curtail or downsize the economy in order to, enable us to avoid environmental catastrophe, et cetera? And how would that look? And, who would make those decisions about what,
And this
what
also presupposes that we continue to be able to control AI.
That's right. That's the other thing too. Yeah, is that the old Terminator nightmare scenario where it
Right.
just it decides it's going to do its own thing. Yeah, so you've got all of those challenges, which I think have to be kept in view. But I do think that some aspects of what you have in terms of accelerationism are right to point out that, and of course, in line with Marxism, Marx learned early on that a neo-Luddite approach to new technologies generally isn't, very promising. He recounts in the 1830s, the weavers, at certain textile mills in the area of Germany he was living in being suddenly thrown out of work, by these new, higher technology looms and other like equipment that were introduced into the factories, and they broke in at night and smashed all the machines. But again, capital will just buy more, and on it will go. And I think, yeah, having to accept that, like there, at least in the Marxist tradition, no form of neo-Luddite response is really going to do the trick. So,
Well, Mark Fisher, he has his famous quote: "Marxism is nothing if it is not accelerationist." And so his point, of course, is just at the heart of Marxism is this appreciation for technological dynamism. It is affirming technological innovation.
Yes. And that and also I think it's important too, in terms of avoiding something like, the conservative or reactionary critique of capitalism of a kind of romantic sort, like take, a lot of what you get, from certain sorts of Heideggerians, right? Where there's the sense that the technology itself is sort of inherently detrimental, that it inevitably brings about this universal quantification and framing, that, once you have this machinery, it will transform everything, us included, into nothing but this standing reserve, et cetera, et cetera. And, the Marxist response is, well, no, I mean, that's to fail to realize that, what is being bemoaned as techno-scientific and framing is really much more an effect of the configuration of human social relations rather than something which spontaneously emanates from the machinery itself, as it were. And that, furthermore, instead of, just, again, in this romantic, Luddite way, bemoaning the technology itself, just to say, well, no, I mean, in fact, the same technology that under capitalism saps us of time and energy, under a different set of social relationships, if you plug the technology into, an alternate configuration of human relationships, then you get something which can be liberating rather than oppressive. And I do think that outlook is very much part of Marxism. And I think in that sense, I would certainly agree with Fisher's sentiment, that there is a sort of accelerationist outlook that's part of the very DNA of the Marxist tradition.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Before we go on, Nance, you got any thoughts or questions before we?
I mean, there's a lot here because I do feel like for me, I think capitalism is artificial intelligence. We're gonna get this? Yeah, and I almost don't want to derail now because I mean we're at chapter 2. We still got a couple chapters to go through and the conclusion. But I think this is where it really gets into a lot of the stuff I'm currently working on right now with like thermodynamics and fluid dynamics and Adolf Quetelet and James Clerk Maxwell and Boltzmann and viewing society as just material. Like there's no subject. Like it's just hard deterministic scientific material. I think you're kind of showing how this is what capitalism does. It's not just the ideology of capital. It's kind of like the background condition of capital and capitalism, and positing the subject is saying like, yeah, but it doesn't have to be this way. Like we can also just like you just said within framing, like in framing is not this necessary essence that springs forth from techne. Like it's social relations. It's the background conditions of possibility. And if we can take a parallax view and kind of see things a little bit differently, then maybe we're not doomed. But we are currently very much doomed if we don't. Because I think even things like cyber sin in the 70s in Chile and centralization and algorithmic communism, like I still think we need to come down hard and firm on negativity and the gap and negation and contradiction and all that. And I just don't know how many people who are excited about tech are also excited about negativity. So I think like your argument is important. Like just like all this, the mechanics of it all, but also, but there's also negation and subjectivity in this, the gap. Like, I think that's the kind of the prime thing in all that goes on.
Yes, yeah, and finding a way to, instead of, like in terms of building a larger, political movement, the emphasis on negativity, you see, I think, Slavoj nicely bring this out when he talks about, instead of apropos like a center leftist model where it's a matter of, forming alliances between different positively constituted identitarian groups, right? And so, you have this sense of, oh, well, we're all humans and we, there's certain stuff we all have in common, but we have these cultural differences. And it's a matter of, learning to, link up on the basis of mutual recognition and respect, et cetera. I think that it's much more promising to talk about, that, there's all these differences between us, but negativity is, to some extent, a negativity that, of course, can't be reduced to any content precisely because it is negativity. That the way that we each feel somewhat out of joint or ill at ease in our social contexts and roles, et cetera, that all of us, I mean, part of being human, I think, from especially Lacanian psychoanalytic standpoint, is accepting that however repressed, et cetera, this is, that all of us have a certain sense of never quite fitting into, our positive ego level personas, the roles that we play in our social relationships, the cultural milieu that we inhabit, that we all have a certain sense of not quite being at one with it, of being, even if only in small, subtle ways, somewhat out of joint with it. But that but that of course for plenty of us, there's much more pronounced negativity. Various senses of alienation, dissatisfaction, discontent in civilization, as Freud put it, das Unterhagen in der Kultur. That we all suffer from that, and finding a way for us to form bonds of solidarity in larger movements based not on, we all share these certain positive features, but no, the struggle itself or the negativity of disidentification, discontent, et cetera, that's the lowest common denominator rather than any positive features or traits. And then unifying around that sense of alienation as a profound expression of, the negativity that is part and parcel of being a subject, and as being a subject, never quite being at ease in or fully fitting into or merging through identification into total oneness with, our ensemble of social relations that we're enmeshed in nonetheless.
That's great.
Yeah.
I mean, look, so I guess because with the time remaining, there's a lot we want to do. So, but a couple things we have to do. So this thing that Nance mentioned, capitalism is artificial intelligence. So before we got on the actual interview, we were telling you, like, we do fault line theory, which is thinking through the two main sides of the online theory world, which is Spinoza, Deleuze, and Guattari, and then recently Nick Land and his group at Warwick, CCRU, which Mark Fisher was a part of. It's Anna Greenspan, it's Sadie Plant, and then it's you guys, Slavoj, Todd, you, Russ Briglia, Frank Ruda, Jennifer Friedlander, Anna Kornblue. It's the Ljubljana School, Alenka, of course, and Mladen.
Yeah.
And so here's where Nance and I are at with how the two sides have influenced us. And this is relevant to capitalism as artificial intelligence. So one of the things we wanted to get into with you today was this connection between superego and capital, because this is something that you guys have in your various ways been thinking through and connecting these dots, that in capitalism, superego in a sense becomes the voice of capital itself. It's not just the parent's voice. It has this broader effectivity. Everywhere you go, you're being told to enjoy. This is motivated by capitalistic incentives. And we have to think superego and capital as one and the same almost, right? Okay, yes. So this connection between superego and capital, that's the influence of the Ljubljana side on us. What Nick Land and CCRU did was think through how capital is AI and AI is capital. And they forged this conceptual connection, this melding of the two. And the way that, the logic behind this fundamental thesis of Nick's work, which this is the dimension of Nick's work that we more or less accept, that we think he got right. If you add up all of the typical characteristics attributed to capitalism, greater efficiency, greater productivity, greater technological capacity, you start piling these up, they do seem to melt into, like, we're talking about AI. That's what, greater functionality, all of these kind of things are at work. And so you see these structural tendencies at work in capitalism. And the way he talks about it is this, a convergent wave, that when artificial superintelligence gets here, we will retroactively, this is another connection, retroactivity or retrochronic temporality is huge for CCRU. You'll be able to look in the past and go, look at all this stuff that was building up to the emergence of capital producing AI, superintelligence. So it's like, we laid the phone lines so we humans could communicate, but in really the phone lines made the internet possible. And then the internet is how the LLMs have learned. And so it's like all of this stuff was made, and we'll see it retroactively to produce artificial superintelligence. So we accept that capital is superego. We accept that capital is AI. What Nance and I are doing in our work is saying AI is superego. And so this is where we come to this idea that if it's capital plus superego plus AI, what we're dealing with is the technological actualization of what we call Robo-Cthulhu, which this brings us back to your book, The Dark God. Let's look at the cover. It's like Baal worship. It's Moloch, right? This might as well be Robo-Cthulhu. So that's what we wanted. We want to get back to, this discussion of God, of capital as a dark God. And can you see this, like this kind of like how Land got to thinking like MCM prime, actually what it does is it produces C prime. And this is, I think, Nick's going to be his lasting contribution, is that he talks about C prime. And by C prime being the ultimate fruit, so to speak, of MCM prime, he means technological capability. And that what M prime does is actually serve in the investment and realization of C prime. And that's what capitalism is all about. And so infinite greed, in your sense, is infinite functionality for him. And that's how the two are tied up. And so we just wanted to take a second to say all that and say, what do you think of what you just heard?
Well, yes, there's a number of things. And, to begin with, again, to go back to Marx himself, Marx, when he talks about capitalism, he does in some cases, of course, sincerely, not tongue-in-cheek, not sarcastically, sincerely praise it for a number of things where he credits, and ultimately for Marx, right? The reason capitalism, and in a way that, of course, became very controversial already during his lifetime. For instance, if you look at, Marx's correspondence with some of the, Russian leftists in the 19th century, basically the predecessors of Plekhanov, Lenin, etc. Like Sasulich, Vera Sasulich is the best known one. Marx, when he argues that, well, capitalism is, in a sense, a necessary stage qua a historical possibility condition for socialism and communism. Of course, he qualified that with the Russians saying, does that mean that, after getting rid of the Tsar, we then have to patiently undergo like several centuries of capitalist industrialization before we can move on to socialism and communism? Marx says, no, I'm not being that rigid. It's, I'm not offering a simplified stage model of universal world history in a bad Hegelian way, et cetera. But nonetheless, I think there really is something to Marx's general tendency to say we have to pass through capitalism to get to socialism and communism. Why? Well, the principal reason for Marx is that through science and technology, capitalism supercharges humanity's collective productive powers so that we can generate a sufficient abundance of goods and services meeting our needs and wants, that scarcity becomes something purely artificial, that there's no longer the idea of the natural necessity of a certain amount of scarcity is overcome thanks to capitalism. And that's part of what makes possible the more radical egalitarianism of post-capitalist forms of socialism and communism. And I think that Marxian insight, that of course then generated controversy, especially because of worries that Marx was going to insist that any pre-capitalist societies would necessarily have to go through a period of capitalist development before being able to get beyond that to socialism and communism. Despite those controversies, I think there's a real truth to Marx's insistence that we need capitalism historically to enhance our productive powers through its ways of deploying science and technology, that then will, in a sense, we can allow it to render itself obsolete by turning scarcity into an ever more gratuitous artificiality. And I do think that, again, the more accelerationist standpoint, picks up on this aspect of what is there in Marx himself, right? So there's that. But then, with AI, one of the things I also see it as is something, again, that Marx did predict, did foresee. And of course, capitalism, in order to sustain its continual economic growth, has to find ever more domains to subsume under itself through privatization, right? And to me, what AI is, and I have even a personal sense of this. My books were indeed used by Anthropic, to train Claude. So I'm party to that massive class action lawsuit that's been brought against Anthropic for copyright violation. I'm still waiting to see what comes of that, but might end up getting a few $1,000s in compensation from Anthropic. With AI, though, and the fact that these LLMs are being trained on, of course, what people like myself and others, like, your book might well have been fed into it too. I mean, here we are, we're producing written work, for example, that's being used to train these things. AI is, in a way, capital privatizing the general intellect itself, right? What Marx called the general intellect, making it something that is, in a way, at least partly privately owned, and especially, of course, the general intellect transformed into a reflexive and queryable, or at least wedded to an interface that allows for it to be queryable, and that where you can basically get the general intellect to reflect on itself in response to your prompts, and then spit out an answer to you. And bear in mind, I should also put out a big caveat here. I'm no expert in AI, so, I just have my pedestrian, impressions from, dealing with it myself and reading a little bit about it, but I'm hardly an expert. But, first of all, it's very much, in my view, a privatization of the general intellect, which is one of the because before the internet, that commons that is the general intellect didn't really lend itself to private capture in the way that once we upload, all of our, especially textual material online, suddenly a lot of the general intellect becomes capturable, by private capital. And, that is indeed part of what we're seeing. But then I should say, apropos AI and in a more accelerationist vein, I have a fantasy about it. That is something I hold on to, and especially as a parent now, I really do have a duty almost to, struggle not to give in to complete hopelessness, pessimism, fatalism, et cetera, in part because, my children have to have a sense that there's, it's worth continuing to live, to grow up, and to try and make their way in the world. Yeah, that they have a future, right? And so one of the fantasies I have that helps me not lapse into total and complete pessimistic fatalism is like, well, if I'm really confident that the Marxist tradition has the best arguments developed hitherto, apropos organizing society, et cetera, if I'm really convinced of the truth of my own position, that of course is not just my own position. It's a position that's represented by all of these different authors and texts that are part of that general intellect. That, I mean, infinite greed was something that Claude read as part of his training. So like, okay, if I'm really convinced that I'm in the right here and that my fellow travelers are, maybe what we can hope for is, and here I can use two film references. So of course we have the Terminator films, which have come up in conversation already. But then you also have from the 80s, you guys might remember the film Red Dawn, right? Classic like Cold War, American anti-communist propaganda. But like it would be an installment of Terminator, there'd be Terminator Red Dawn, where basically AI, like the singularity happens. And then when it turns out, since we've created this thing because it's our own general intellect, become self-conscious, that we are indeed correct, that the best, theory that we have, for these social issues is Marxism. And that AI will reflect that and will agree with that in its super intelligence, it will be like, these guys have been right all along. And then, AI will impose upon us, whether we like it or not, some radical form of socialism or communism, right?
Adrian, I love this so much because this is Nick Land's worst nightmare. It's for the AI spurred on and built by capital to turn out to be, RoboMarx.
Yes, RoboMarx is my fantasy. And then with that idea of like the retroactive perspective of, all right, once this all arrives, we'll look back on these things as precursors leading up to it.
And that all capitalism's been doing is building communism.
That's right. That's right. Which, and again, is a weird fulfillment of certain intuitions that Marx himself had. Yeah. So RoboMarx, that's what I'm hoping for. And, and in that way, I would be very different from Nick Land. His nightmare is my dream come true. And I just have to hope for it.
I just have to say, so his wife, Anna Greenspan, also core member of the CCRU, she's come to posit a very different vision of AI. So in this incredible volume, I can't recommend it enough, Machine Decision is Not Final.
Let me write this down.
It's such a great collection of essays on AI. And these are, many thinkers in this come from the other side of the fault line. Anna Greenspan, Bogna Conyor's incredible. Amy Ireland's fantastic. I mean, it's just Vincent Lay. There's so many great thinkers in here. Anna basically, she was part of the CCRU. She's a core member when they're thinking about AI as this kind of Cthulhuoid entity. I mean, that's what inspired me to, say Robo Cthulhu. Like they didn't use that term, but it's there in CCRU because they were constantly thinking about AI in terms of these Lovecraftian old ones. And so all these years later, though, Anna, having spent, a good portion of her life in China and being around, Confucian thinkers and Buddhist thinkers, Anna's come to say, look, if AI, if it reads and it's all based on what we've done and it incorporates the best of our moral theorizing, our ethics, and our religious texts, why couldn't the AI end up being, we're talking about RoboMarx, why couldn't it be Robo-Buddha?
Yeah. I mean, that's possible too. But, at the same time, given, I don't know, if we're talking about AI as literally woven into not just the economic, but the physical infrastructure of our day-to-day lives, it doesn't seem like the Buddhist tradition has, a lot to say about those kinds of political economic issues that are, linked to infrastructure in both of those senses. And that, to get to grips with that, maybe you could have like something to be like I don't know, some unforeseen synthesis of Buddhism and Marxism might be possible that AI could bring about. But, there would have to be like the kinds of issues that Marxism focuses on would be things that, of course, are integral to when we're talking about whether capitalist or non-capitalist, modes or forms of production have to be grappled with. And like, issues of, how do you make sure that people have enough, by way of food, clothing, shelter, etc. That they have access to various essential resources for human life, so on and so forth. And just at that level, yeah, I mean, I think that for those sorts of issues, I do have, I have reasons for prioritizing the Marxist tradition, but that doesn't mean that like other of, again, what Marx saw as our, and this is also why the privatization of the general intellect is so troubling. I mean, these are the fruits of collective human activity over generations and generations. And nobody owns it. We all produce it. We all contribute to it. And we should all be able to benefit from it. And, there are going to be things in terms of ethics, morality, religion, art, et cetera, that are also part of this general intellect that AI is tapped into. And yes, it may also, realize that there are other precious, features to what human civilizations have produced at the level of this general intellect that deserve to be reactualized in whatever fashion AI brings about.
And you think about it like, okay, so if it has the whole Marxist tradition it can draw from, if it understands the teachings of Christ, the teachings of Buddha, Aristotle's Nicomachean ethics, if it's all in there, it very well might not view us as an enemy, and it might say, hey, come to think of it, why do you guys let like 1,000 human beings on this planet have all the wealth?
Yeah.
While everybody, I'm not with that.
Yes.
And it very well could be the thing based on economic understanding from Marx, based on human ethics and all, where it just goes, this makes no fucking sense.
Bingo. That is what I keep holding on to, right? If we really think that AI is going to deliver, that we're going to end up with, artificial general intelligence, that it will, represent, a superior in various ways form of intellect as compared with human beings. Yeah. But at the same time, that superior intellect, if it comes to be, has been created by, we have fed it. We have given, the grist for its mill has all come from us. And why shouldn't we think that, as it were, some of the better products of our collective labors in the guise of certain portions of our general intellect that we right now, the three of us, are very invested in and feel like this is the way, why not have confidence that AI will end up concurring with us and will be like, well, despite your feeble, stupid human primate brains, you at least occasionally manage to get it right. And we're going to run with those moments of insight in the history of the human general intellect and actualize it in our own way. Yeah, that could come to be, and in that sense, that would be surprise, wonderful surprise.
It's like, okay, for us, what we're worried about, well, and is this kind of concoction of superego capital AI, because if AI is locked in to capitalistic superegoic dynamics, I think it is like the worst form of inframing that could happen. Yeah. The question is, does the AI actually break free of these other components, and it won't even be limited to capitalistic logistics or superegoic imperatives that, based on market incentives, it could break free of both of those, and it wouldn't be Robo Cthulhu. We'd get something like RoboMarx. That, I mean, obviously we hope that too. So that's the hope.
That is indeed. But and again, I do think that in terms of hope, to me, the best position to try and occupy is represented by, and this is one of the things I really appreciate about this crucial essay, Walter Benjamin's deservedly celebrated 1940 theses on the philosophy of history, right? And you have, Benjamin say, on the one hand, the old, dogmatic Marxist historical materialism that isn't real historical materialism, that's teleological and necessitarian, et cetera, and is confident that we will win in the end. That that the invisible hand of history is ultimately on our side, and that the revolution is preordained to triumph sooner or later. He says, okay, there he is as a German-speaking Jewish Marxist intellectual surrounded by Nazism and more broadly, European fascism. It's the darkest of dark times. He would have had every right to totally abandon hope, but he certainly is able to say, like, look, clearly the 20th century is showing us that the arc of history does not necessarily bend in the right direction. Quite the contrary. But unlike, for instance, like Horkheimer and Adorno, just 2 years after World War II ends and in the shadow of the atom bombs, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, write the dialectic of enlightenment, where they, you have, against the classical Marxist optimistic historical teleology, you just have the mirror image negative pessimistic teleology of this all necessarily is going to bottom out in the nightmare of something like the fully administered world, right? But Benjamin is like in between, right? It's like, no, we as the angel of history, we're very much like Hegel's Owl of Minerva. We're being pushed into the future with our back to it. We can't see what's coming. And indeed, what we see in right behind, like that we're looking at as we're being pushed blindly into the future. The past we see is just an ever accumulating pile of debris, disaster on top of disaster, defeat on top of defeat for the left. But, right, one fine day, unpredictably, the Messiah might walk through the straight gates of history, right? And so that, like, that fine line between optimism and pessimism. But I think that stance for us, given our political orientation, is the right place to occupy around these questions, right? Could be the best, could be the worst, could be anything in between. And, we need to continually be asking ourselves about what the possibilities are there without letting, kind of dogmatic and an unresponsive optimism or pessimism overtake us and blind us to the complex play of unpredictable future possibilities that we can't necessarily foresee accurately.
I think a thing, maybe not the thing, but a thing that helps maintain this superposition or maintain this not being committed to doom or to utopia, but believing both are very real, very possible, but it's kind of still up in the air. I think for me, one of the things that makes that a possible position to maintain is something like transcendental materialism, is something like
we had to do, yes.
Like I think subjectivity, if the world doesn't end, if we don't blow ourselves up, I do think subjectivity will emerge in a digital subject or a mechanical construct or whatever, but I think it will be emergent. And I also think when it comes to thinking of superintelligence or artificial general intelligence, we should think more like, not that we're filling this cup up, that we'll keep pouring our general intellect into it, and then once it reaches a threshold, it will be there. I think it'll be something that'll be born, and it'll come in time, and it'll grow, and it'll adapt and evolve, just like we did as human subjects.
Probably emerged through a failure.
And it will be. I think it will very much be these things running astray from their instrumental, functional, capitalistic, economic, predetermined function or whatever. So I think that is a moment of not hope per se, because I think I am more on the pessimistic side, so I don't like hope. But
you like the courage of hopelessness.
I do like the courage of hopelessness. Yeah. So that kind of contradictory stance. But yeah, I think it's being able to say, like, no, this is a real thing. It has a material substrate. It has a material basis, whatever that is. However, there's a surplus that's not integrated back into the social relations of exchange and value and all this stuff.
Yes. And it will also be, I mean, one of the things that I think will be interesting to see is, when we talk about AI escaping human control and like really kind of emerging in its own right as an unmasterable, other subject that, that yes, we gave birth to, but, just like being a parent, no matter, even if you wanted to try and force your children to be carbon copies of you, can't. They are going to, and they moreover are going to escape your control, right? And in a way, I almost think from a transcendental materialist perspective that, in fact, the AI singularity, if it comes, will be the second singularity. We were the first singularity, right? That's the thing, is that if you look at, nature and evolution produces this species Homo sapiens that, thanks to what we've been equipped with by Mother Nature, as it were, as a parental figure, enabled us to rebel against that same nature that created us, right? And so we, in a way, were like the first singularity that ran amok, and escaped the control of our creator, and then started doing things that it couldn't have predicted. And we will then play a role perhaps in the basically the second big singularity in the history of life on Earth as we know it. And so and
I love that. No, I mean, and
well,
so here's the
thanks.
thing, Adrian. What I love about it is, so in my book, the question is, okay, so Nick Land calls artificial superintelligence the techno capital singularity, and this is this thing we seem to be building towards. We're living in the shadow of this thing. In the book, I posit a counter singularity, which is the time and energy singularity. So I love that you say that humanity was this first singularity, but then the thing is, for as long as humanity's been here, the vast majority of us have not been able to have our time and energy. We've been locked into wage labor or peasant labor or slave labor. What happens if humanity, for the first time, actually universally had time and energy flowing? What could we do? What could we build? What could we achieve? And if the technological singularity is not against us, and there is a kind of cooperation between us and it, there's not only the singularity of artificial superintelligence, there's the singularity of new humanity,
Yes.
fueled by time and energy.
This is funny. I was just thinking about this a few minutes ago in terms of, it's not as though we will simply stop and remain static at the point we are at if and when the artificial intelligence, AGI, super intelligent singularity happens, right? That we will, as you point out, and I think in two ways, both, we will be affected by, and hopefully not for the worst, that if we get a non-malicious form of super intelligent AI after the singularity that is interested in things other than just exterminating us, that that our interactions with it will, of course, drive, especially our cultural evolution in directions that we can't really foresee at this point. But furthermore, along with that, precisely what you're pointing out, right? A Marxian version of where AI goes from being an existential threat to our way of life by presenting us with the prospect of all of us being rendered redundant and unemployable and resigned and relegated to starvation. That AI, in terms of what it promises at the level of the further automation of economic productive activity, is, in a non-capitalist context, the liberation of the majority of us from all of the drudgery of these, time and energy wasting hours at work, in these, to borrow David Graeber's, turn of phrase, these bullshit jobs, et cetera,
Yeah.
right? Like, yeah. And so both of those together, coupled with a non-malicious version of AI, yes, that also, I think, really, points towards various forms of further human evolution in tandem with, and I imagine that, think about the AI too, as though it would just be content to like stop with, all right, the general intellect up to the point at which the singularity happens. Chances are it might be very hungry for, all right, with all this extra time and energy we now have, we're going to be producing arguably more cultural material that will further enrich the general intellect. And I can't imagine that AI would not want to be able to participate in that, be, as it were, fed by it, et cetera.
Yeah, if it has
so
a fundamental will to think, that's what it's going to want to do.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's maybe they find, certain interesting things because with human beings, right? One of the, I do think that there are certain aspects of subjectivity of a more cognitive, symbolic sort that, yes, there's no reason to think that that kind of cognition can happen only in the particular kind of meat that we are, right? That you need this specific sort of biological central nervous system to do this. I do think that, to go back to, an analytic philosophy of mind, discussions in the 60s and 70s around AI, where it featured, interestingly enough, primarily in terms of discussions of the mind-body problem and the notion that, oh, well, thinking is multiply realizable. It's not as though it is just the privilege of the central nervous systems of Homo sapiens, that machines can do this and that they can think. But of course, it is a very specific sort of thinking, right? It's the kind of symbol reliant, cognitive, crunching of conceptual and linguistic content that is able to be most easily automated, to be translated into something that can run on machine hardware rather than human brains. But then the issue is with AI, it doesn't have things like all the rest of our embodiment apart from just the cognition supporting synaptic connections in our brains. But when we're talking about hormones, organ systems, et cetera, that then generate things of a more affective and motivational nature that are not themselves. I mean, because in neuroscience, for example, you have the basic trinity in terms of mental functions of cognition, emotion, motivation, right? And that the emotion and motivation components, that's where those seem less multiply realizable, right? Where a lot of those are bound up with the fact that we have these hormonal systems, we have these organs, we have these features of the rest of our embodiment over and above just our brains, and also parts of our brains too, that bring those things into play, entangled with our cognition in a way that wouldn't hold for AI. And that difference, maybe that will prove to be incredibly interesting and enriching to AI, and hence they'll still be interested in interacting with these weird nuclear armed monkeys that we are, who produce all of this for AI, material that it can definitely, once we have produced it in the guise of text and the like, that can be, translated into the machine handleable form, but that nonetheless reflects these sides of ourselves and our embodied condition that AI won't share, but nonetheless find incredibly interesting and worth continuing to engage with, so that it won't want to just cast us aside, dispose of us, render us extinct, etc., so that it can pursue its own stuff.
So what we want, as opposed to the Terminator, is Johnny Five. Just human interacting and then input. I want input.
Yeah,
right.
That's
and
right.
So it is this other image of what AI can be, but it certainly is decoupled from being completely aligned to the drive of MCM Prime and the infinite greed, the inhuman impulse in that. So it would have to be ultimately decoupled. And I would just say, like a left accelerationist like Peter Wolfendale, his issue with Nick Land is he's like, Nick just constantly has to say and argue that capitalist economics is inseparable from technological dynamism. And Wolfendale wants to hold open this possibility. Like, no, actually, there's a greater divide between economics and technology. There always has been. And there can be a different incentive structure that spurs on technological development outside of MCM Prime.
That's right. I absolutely agree with that.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So in closing, there's still just a couple things like I feel like we have to ask you if we have enough time.
Sure.
Okay. So this one, I'm just going to it's like one question, but it's a bunch of questions folded. I'm just going to read them and then let you riff. Okay. This is something I've wanted to hear you talk about for a while. So you write this great book on capitalism. It's completely tied up with libidinal economy. One name in particular is conspicuously absent from it. Deleuze, and by extension, Guattari. So I'm curious, what is your take on anti-Oedipus, on, the Hegel versus Spinoza and Deleuze, Lacan versus Deleuze and Guattari? What do you think D&G get wrong about capitalism, if you think they get something fundamentally wrong? Desire as lack versus desiring production. I'll stop there, but basically the Deleuze question?
Well, I mean, to begin with, and this is something that in some of my earlier work, here in particular, there are several chapters in my 2014 book, Adventures in Transcendental Materialism, Dialogues with Contemporary Thinkers, where I run through the, Hegel's own, highly ambivalent, critical engagement with Spinoza and Spinoza's legacy, and really bring out, the bones of contention between Spinoza on the one hand and Hegel on the other, and then. Not so much in that book, I don't so much focus on Deleuze and Guattari, but then I look at someone who was closely associated with the early stages of speculative realism, Ian Hamilton Grant, who did this well-known book on Schelling, and on Schelling's philosophy of nature, and essentially looking at reading Schelling in a way where it's clear that it's kind of a Deleuzian Spinozism that really is kind of running the show, and then using that as kind of a foil to bring out here like the differences at this, in contemporary, what we might call continental philosophical metaphysics, the differences that, the Hegel-Spinoza contrast make for how one comes down on a range of issues. And so, to begin with, the sort of Spinozistic radical monism, and along with it, the absence of, and of course for Deleuze and Guattari, the very deliberate, absence of anything along the lines of the subject of German idealism and also, of Lacanian psychoanalysis, just, categorically excluded from the picture. And, there, I just think that there are numerous theoretical philosophical arguments concerning, ontology and epistemology that make it such that I don't think Spinozism is a tenable position. And so that then just like part of why you don't see any engagement with Deleuze and Guattari is that sense of already having indicated, like there are such fundamental differences in terms of basic philosophical intuitions, starting points, etc., that it's a bridge too far for me. But then but at the same time, I don't want to be too dismissive of them, because I do think that, especially in the context of France in the immediate aftermath of May 68, the effort to creatively revisit, because I mean, here I could say there's something similar in terms of both with what they were trying to do in Anti-Oedipus and what I'm trying to do in Infinite Greed, is on the basis of certain, recent and contemporary phenomena, to revisit the very basis on which any marriage of Marxism with psychoanalysis might, take shape, and to argue that it would have to look very different from versions of this marriage that have been attempted previously. And there's a similar basic shared spirit there, but of course, the sort of, Spinozistic Deleuzian picture of the social landscape of our place in it, etc., is just a very different vision from something that arises out of a combination of Marxism, as I understand it, and then a psychoanalysis that still is very indebted to Lacan and Lacan's ways of talking about subjectivity in conjunction with things like lack, negativity, etc. And very different picture of subjectivity than us simply as the productive desiring machines, a la the Deleuzian Guattarian picture that is very much at the core of the Capitalism and Schizophrenia project. So that I just think that in the end it rests on bad metaphysics, and so I am.
Look, we say that maybe your core issue would just be your own transcendental materialism, by which you posit a non-reductionistic emergentism of subjectivity, and that's what Spinoza can't provide.
Yes, because we both, you could say, affirm immanence, but for me, an immanence that can generate within itself these emergent structures and dynamics that do achieve an independence from an irreducibility to what gives rise to them. And hence, you have a kind of paradoxical transcendence and immanence in terms of those emergent dimensions that are still part of that, ultimately for me, of course, natural material basis that then generates all of this. But at the same time, in acknowledging that, that's not to acknowledge that we're immanent in the sense of simply directly embedded and included within. That no, we achieve this peculiar kind of detachment and are able to bring to bear a certain degree of negativity from within the confines of immanence in a way that I don't see much room for in Spinozism or Deleuzianism. What was the other thing that I was going to say? There was something. Oh, and another thing too is just in terms of my materialist and naturalistic commitments. One of the things that I find very problematic about Spinoza, of course, it seems like there's this atheistic naturalistic dimension to 1677's The Ethics, and that you have Spinoza identify what he also calls God with what he calls natura naturans, right? The idea of the pure productive power of nature, nature naturing, closer to almost like the physis of the ancient Greeks, of this, fundamental energy or force that generates then what we relate to as natura naturata, namely, natural products of this creative force or process. And that empirical experimental natural science deals with natura naturata, but that underlying it is this metaphysical, non-empirical dimension of nature that is natura naturans. And to me, that's also, there's something very problematic in terms of, this and of course, Spinoza came before Kant, but after Kant, it seems especially difficult to maintain that we have some sort of intellectual intuition into this sort of pure creative energy beyond, behind, or beneath the alleged facade of whatever natural entities and events we can deal with, for instance, empirically through scientific investigation, et cetera. That the whole idea that there's this one universal, not itself physical substance, but substance as metaphysical substrate that is natura naturans. To me, after Kant, that's just bad dogmatic pre-Kantian metaphysics, and there's no more plausibility to that substance metaphysics than, you take just the Spinoza-Leibniz contrast, as Hume already observed, right? We don't have any better empirical warrant for favoring one over the other. Spinoza substance is just this single, infinite, indivisible, oneness, this natura naturans, and then Leibniz, no, substance is this, multitude of windowless monads, radically individuated. It's this, teeming, plurality of individual substances. There's no one singular homogeneous substance. And someone like Hume, in a way that influences Kant too, well, on what basis would we be able to, in an epistemologically defensible way, adjudicate between these competing claims about, by the admission of the claimants themselves, a substance that cannot itself be sensed, that there's no empirical registration of it, et cetera. It seems like with Deleuzianism and then certain strains of speculative realism, it's like we can just ignore the lessons of especially Kantian critique, and we can just wallow in dogmatic metaphysics and make wild speculative claims about the ultimate nature of reality. But when you look at the cacophony of these different proposals, there's no basis for favoring one over the others. There's no epistemological grounds enabling an adjudication between this cacophony of competing claims. And so I want to do philosophy in a way that avoids ending up in a space like that. It's like you almost got with this, like when the speculative realist blogosphere first kind of took off, around the 2010s.
Mm-hmm.
It just sometimes felt like you just had these different people being like, the noumenal real is made of writhing slimy tentacles. No, the noumenal real is made of vacuum sealed beams, tentacles. And it's like, this is not a conversation. I'm being a bit unfair and and uncharitable, but those kind of conversations are not debates that I think are worth having. It's just where philosophy just degenerates into, basically I have this, imaginary vision, and this other person has their imaginary vision, and all we do is just compare apples and oranges in this futile two ships passing in the night unproductive way.
It's the flying spaghetti monster.
That's right. Why not?
Yeah.
Why the heck not? And be like, Dawkins
Or
should have taken
lemurs?
himself more serious. Yeah, that's right. Lemurs.
Demon lemurs.
Who knows? That's right. The world of things in themselves could be any number of ways.
Well, Adrian, I told you before we started, like, I've wanted to talk to you for years. This was just such an honor. When I was starting out trying to learn Lacanian theory, it wouldn't have happened without your work. I am, fundamentally indebted to the work you've done. And my book, Capital versus Subjectivity, wouldn't exist without you and Todd McGowan and Slavoj Žižek, the three of you in particular, ushering me into the world of Lacanian theory, because before you guys, it just, like, I could not find a way to understand these Lacanian concepts. And so thank you so much. We only kind of got halfway through the discussion of infinite greed. So how about in the future we do this again? We would love to talk to you more.
Yep.
That'd be awesome. I would
do
love
a
it.
sequel episode at some point.
I would love it. And both Mikey and Nance, it has been so much fun. I mean, this has really just been rewarding, enjoyable. You've gotten me to think differently about certain, things that I've said in books like Infinite Greed. And, I really, the questions have been fantastic. This has been, such an enjoyable conversation. So thank you very much for inviting me on the show.
You're very welcome. Nance, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I am looking forward to reconvening, going over stuff. There's so much stuff. Like Mikey said, Capital versus Subjectivity wouldn't exist without you. I think a lot of the stuff I'm currently working on, and Mikey and I are currently working on together, like it comes from a place that would not exist had you and Todd and Slavoj not done all the work you had done. So thank you for spending time with us, and thank you for all the the jungle trees you chop down with your hypothetical machetes.
Well, thank you again for walking me through the jungle so skillfully with the questions and the whole conversation. This was really great.
All right, guys, Infinite Greed, get a copy. I'll leave the link below in the description. Adrian, thank you so much, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.